The restaurant was unusually busy that evening. Families filled the tables, waiters rushed between orders, and the soft hum of conversation mixed with the sound of plates and glasses. It looked like any normal dinner rush, the kind where people came to relax after a long day. Among the staff was a young waitress named Lena, moving carefully from table to table. What many customers noticed immediately was that Lena had only one arm. Despite this challenge, she worked with incredible focus, balancing trays against her shoulder, carefully placing plates, and making sure every customer received their food with a polite smile. For Lena, this job meant everything. It helped her support her mother and younger brother at home. Every shift mattered, and she never allowed her condition to slow her down, even when the work became exhausting. At one corner table, however, sat a group of loud young men who seemed more interested in making trouble than enjoying their meal. As Lena approached to serve them, one of them snickered loudly. "Hey, careful. Don't drop it," one joked, glancing at her missing arm. The others burst into laughter. Lena forced a small smile, pretending not to hear. She had dealt with rude customers before. Usually, ignoring them made things easier. But tonight, their comments didn't stop. They began whispering loudly, mocking the way she carried plates, making sure nearby tables could hear. A few customers looked uncomfortable, but no one said anything. Most people simply avoided eye contact, hoping the awkward moment would pass. At that same moment, the restaurant door opened quietly. A tall, familiar figure stepped inside, dressed simply in a dark jacket and jeans. He walked in calmly, almost unnoticed among the busy crowd, and took a seat at a corner table. It was Steven Seagal. He didn't announce himself or draw attention. Instead, he calmly scanned the room while waiting for service. That was when his eyes fell on Lena and the table of young men laughing at her expense. He watched silently as she tried to continue working while enduring their mockery. Sometimes, people carry their struggles quietly, hoping the world will show a little kindness. But not everyone does. And the group of bullies had no idea that someone was watching. Someone who was not going to stay silent for long. Because what would happen next was something no one in that restaurant would ever forget. Lena tried to keep her focus as she moved between tables, but the laughter from the group of young men followed her across the restaurant. Every time she passed their table, another joke or sarcastic comment was thrown her way. A few minutes later, one of them snapped his fingers loudly. "Hey, we need more drinks," he called out, even though their glasses were still half full. Lena walked back, keeping her professional smile. Serving drinks with one arm required extra care, and she balanced the tray carefully as she placed the glasses down. But just as she set the final drink on the table, one of the men deliberately knocked his glass over. Liquid spilled across the table and onto the floor. "Seriously," he said loudly. "You can't even serve drinks properly?" The group burst into laughter again. Several nearby customers turned to look. Some shook their heads in disapproval, but once again, no one intervened. Lena quickly grabbed napkins, apologizing even though everyone could see it wasn't her fault. "I'm really sorry," she said softly, kneeling to clean the mess. For Lena, losing control of the situation meant risking complaints, and complaints could cost her job. So she swallowed her embarrassment and kept working. Across the room, Steven Seagal watched the entire exchange. His face remained calm, but his attention was fixed on the scene. He noticed the waitress's trembling hands and the effort she made to remain composed despite the humiliation. The young men weren't finished. A few minutes later, they began calling her again, asking for extra sauces, more napkins, and small requests one after another. Each time she walked away, they laughed behind her back. Some customers nearby had started recording the situation on their phones, sensing something unfair was happening. Whispered conversations spread across tables. "Why is no one stopping them?" someone muttered quietly. Situations like this happen more often than people realize. Workers in public-facing jobs are often forced to endure disrespect because they fear losing their income. Many choose silence over confrontation just to survive another workday. Before we continue, tell us something in the comments. Which country and city are you watching this story from? And have you ever witnessed someone being bullied in public while others stayed silent? Back at the table, one of the bullies called Lena over once more. "We're still waiting," he complained loudly, even though she had already brought everything they asked for. "I'll check again," Lena replied, her voice slightly shaky now. As she turned away, another cruel remark followed her, and the group laughed once more. Steven leaned back slightly in his chair, watching her walk away. His patience was running thin. The atmosphere in the restaurant had changed. Conversations were quieter now. Many customers sensed the tension building, as if something unavoidable was about to happen. And at that very moment, Lena returned to the table once more, unaware that the situation was only seconds away from changing completely. Because someone in that restaurant was finally about to stand up. The restaurant no longer felt relaxed. The cheerful noise from earlier had faded into uneasy silence as more customers began noticing the situation unfolding around Lena and the group of young men. Lena approached their table once again, hoping this would finally be the last request. She carried a small tray with extra napkins and condiments they had demanded. But as she placed them down, one of the men leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "We're not paying," he said loudly. Lena blinked in confusion. "I'm sorry. The service here is terrible," another added. "Food took too long. Drinks spilled. And honestly, how are you supposed to serve properly like this?" His eyes dropped deliberately toward her missing arm. The table erupted in laughter again. A few gasps could be heard from nearby tables. Even customers who had tried to ignore the situation now looked openly uncomfortable. Lena stood frozen for a moment, unsure how to respond. She had followed every instruction, handled every request politely, and still they continued humiliating her. "Sir, I did everything I could," she said quietly. "If there's a problem, I can call my manager." "Yeah, go ahead," one of them replied mockingly. "Maybe they'll hire someone who can actually do the job." The words hit harder than she expected. For a brief moment, her composure cracked. Her eyes watered, and she quickly turned away, heading toward the kitchen before anyone could see her cry. Near the entrance, a young child sitting with his parents watched her walk away. "Mom," the child asked softly, "why are they being mean to her?" The parents had no answer. Like many others, they simply looked away. Moments like this reveal something uncomfortable about society. People often know something is wrong, but fear of confrontation keeps them silent. Everyone waits for someone else to step in. Across the room, Steven Seagal slowly exhaled. He had seen enough. He watched Lena disappear behind the kitchen door, shoulders slightly shaking. Then he looked back at the table of men still laughing loudly, completely unaware of how their behavior affected everyone around them. Steven placed his napkin neatly on the table and stood up. The movement itself wasn't dramatic, but something about it drew attention. A few nearby customers noticed first, whispering as they recognized him. "Is that Steven Seagal?" someone murmured. Phones subtly shifted direction. Heads turned. Steven walked calmly toward the center of the restaurant, his expression composed but firm. He wasn't angry. He simply looked like someone who had made a decision. Meanwhile, inside the kitchen, Lena tried to compose herself while her manager spoke nervously. "Just avoid them," the manager whispered. "We don't want complaints tonight." Lena nodded, wiping her eyes quickly. She needed this job. She couldn't afford trouble. Unaware of what was happening outside, she took a deep breath and prepared to return to the dining area. At the same time, Steven continued walking slowly toward the Bullies table. The restaurant grew quieter with each step he took. And before we continue, think about this situation. If you were in that restaurant, would you step in to help someone being bullied, or would you stay silent to avoid trouble? Tell us honestly in the comments, what would you do? Back at the table, the young men were still laughing when one of them finally noticed Steven approaching. "Can we help you?" he asked casually, not recognizing him yet. Steven stopped beside their table, his presence suddenly commanding attention. Around them, customers leaned slightly forward in their seats, sensing something important was about to happen. At that exact moment, Lena stepped back into the restaurant, unaware that the atmosphere had completely shifted. She looked toward the table, expecting more humiliation. Instead, she saw Steven Seagal standing there. And in the next few seconds, the entire situation was about to change. Steven stood beside the table without raising his voice or drawing unnecessary attention. His posture was relaxed, but there was something undeniable in his presence that made nearby conversations stop completely. The young man who had spoken earlier looked up at him again, slightly irritated.
Yeah.
"What do you want?" he asked, leaning back in his chair as if unimpressed. Steven glanced at the empty plates, the spilled drink stains on the table, and then calmly met the man's eyes. "I want you to stop harassing the waitress," Steven said evenly. The words weren't loud, but they carried across the table with clarity. For a second, the bullies looked at each other, then laughed. "Mind your own business," one of them replied. "This doesn't concern you." Steven didn't react. He didn't raise his voice or step closer. He simply stayed where he was. "It concerns everyone in this room," he said calmly. "No one deserves to be treated like that while doing their job." One of the men smirked. "Who are you supposed to be? Her bodyguard?" More laughter followed, but it sounded forced now. Lena stood frozen a few steps away, unsure what to do. Her first instinct was fear that this stranger would make things worse for her. She quickly stepped forward. "Sir, it's okay," she said softly to Steven. "Please don't get involved. I don't want any trouble." Steven turned slightly toward her, his tone gentle. "You're not the problem," he said. "You don't deserve this." The bullies rolled their eyes. "Oh, please," one of them said. "She's just doing her job badly." A few customers gasped at the comment. Whispers spread faster now. "That's Steven Seagal," someone said quietly. "I think it is," another replied. Steven ignored the whispers completely. He looked back at the table. "You've been laughing at her disability," he said. "That says more about you than it ever will about her." The man who seemed to be the leader of the group stood up slowly, trying to assert dominance. "You trying to lecture us?" he asked, stepping closer. "Sit down and eat your food." Steven didn't move. "I'm asking you to stop," he replied calmly. The tension was thick now. Even the kitchen staff had paused to watch. Lena's manager hovered nearby, unsure whether to intervene or stay back. Steven's calmness made the situation feel heavier. There was no shouting, no threats, just control. Sometimes real authority doesn't need volume. The standing bully scoffed and waved his hand dismissively. "You don't scare me." Steven nodded slightly. "That's fine. I'm not here to scare you." That simple response unsettled the table more than any threat could have. Lena clutched her notepad tightly. Her heart raced, but something else stirred too, relief. For the first time that night, someone had spoken up for her. Steven addressed the entire table now. "You came here to eat. You got your food. You got your service. What you didn't get was the right to humiliate someone for entertainment." A nearby customer softly applauded before stopping, unsure if it was appropriate. The bullies shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Steven still hadn't mentioned his name. And that was the most powerful part. He wasn't using fame. He wasn't using intimidation. He was using principle. Lena's manager finally stepped closer. "Sir, we can handle this," he said nervously. Steven glanced at him briefly. "Then handle it," he replied calmly. "But handle it fairly." The manager swallowed hard and turned toward the table. The bullies realized now that the room was no longer on their side. Every eye was on them. And in that moment, the balance of power quietly began to shift, even though they still had no idea who they were really dealing with. The leader of the group still stood facing Steven, but the confidence he showed earlier had begun to crack. The laughter at the table had died, replaced by uneasy glances between friends who suddenly felt the entire restaurant watching them. "You think you're some kind of hero," the man said, forcing a smirk. "We were just joking." Steven's expression remained calm. "There's a difference between joking and humiliating someone," he replied. "And everyone here knows which one you were doing." The bully glanced around and noticed something unsettling. Customers were openly staring now, some even shaking their heads in disapproval. Phones were still recording. The attention he once enjoyed now felt uncomfortable. Trying to regain control, he stepped closer to Steven. "Listen," he said in a low voice. "Why don't you go back to your table before this becomes a problem?" Steven didn't move. Instead, he spoke quietly, forcing the man to listen. "Do you know why people mock others?" Steven asked. The man frowned. "What?" Because it makes them feel powerful for a moment, Steven continued. But real strength isn't about making someone weaker. It's about protecting people who can't defend themselves. The words hung in the air. Several customers nodded quietly. Someone whispered, "He's right." Steven gestured subtly toward Lena, who still stood near the counter, unsure whether to approach or stay back. "She works twice as hard as most people in this room," Steven said. "And instead of respecting that, you tried to turn her into a joke." The bully looked back at his friends, hoping for support, but they avoided eye contact. None of them seemed eager to continue. Embarrassment began replacing arrogance. Another customer spoke up from a nearby table. "Leave her alone, man." Soon, murmurs of agreement followed. The energy of the room had completely shifted. Steven hadn't threatened anyone. He hadn't even raised his voice. Yet the bullies were losing control of the situation. One of them tried to laugh it off. All right. Everyone's so sensitive. We're done." But Steven wasn't finished. "Apologize," he said calmly. The table froze. "What?" the leader snapped. "You embarrassed her publicly," Steven continued. "Apologize publicly." The bully clenched his jaw. Pride battled humiliation on his face. Apologizing meant admitting defeat, especially in front of strangers. For several seconds, no one spoke. Even Lena held her breath. Sometimes people act tough only until they're forced to face the consequences of their actions. Real courage isn't about winning fights, it's about admitting when you're wrong. The man finally scoffed and looked toward Lena. "Fine," he muttered. "Sorry." His tone was careless, almost sarcastic. Steven's eyes narrowed slightly. "Mean it." A ripple of tension passed through the restaurant again. The bully hesitated, then spoke louder this time, clearly uncomfortable. "Sorry for making fun of you." The room remained silent, waiting. Lena nodded slightly, still unsure how to react. "It's okay," she said softly. But everyone knew the apology wasn't for her alone. It was for the entire room that had watched the humiliation unfold. The bully sat down heavily, grabbing his phone, clearly wanting the moment to end. Steven finally stepped back. Customers began whispering again, but now the whispers carried approval. Lena felt something she hadn't felt all evening: relief. For hours, she had endured mockery in silence. Now, someone had reminded everyone that respect still mattered. The bullies avoided eye contact with anyone around them, realizing they were no longer the center of attention in the way they had hoped. Steven turned slightly, preparing to walk back to his table. But just as he did, someone near the entrance spoke loudly enough for the entire restaurant to hear. "Wait, isn't that Steven Seagal?" And within seconds, the situation was about to take yet another unexpected turn. The voice near the entrance cut through the restaurant's silence. "Wait, that's Steven Seagal." Heads turned instantly. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as people looked again at the calm figure standing near the bully's table. Within seconds, whispers spread across the room. "It is him." "No way, that's actually Steven Seagal." Look, it's really him." Phones that were already recording now focused entirely on Steven. Some customers stood up slightly, trying to get a clearer view. At the table, the group of young men froze. The leader slowly looked up at Steven again, this time with a completely different expression. Recognition dawned, followed immediately by embarrassment. "You're Steven Seagal," one of them muttered. Steven didn't answer right away. Fame clearly wasn't his concern at that moment. He simply nodded once. The realization hit the group hard. Moments ago, they had tried to intimidate him. Now they understood that the man they mocked wasn't just another customer. He was a globally recognized martial artist and actor known for calm authority and discipline. Their confidence collapsed. Lena watched in disbelief. Only now did she realize why the atmosphere had changed so dramatically. Another customer clapped quietly. Then someone else joined. Within seconds, applause spread through the restaurant. But Steven raised his hand slightly, signaling for calm. He didn't look proud. He didn't smile. Instead, he looked directly at the group again. "Being famous isn't what matters here," he said calmly. "Respect should be given to everyone, Not only when you discover who they are. His voice carried across the room. The bullies shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure what to do next. A restaurant employee whispered excitedly to Lena, "Do you know how lucky you are? Steven Seagal just defended you." But Lena wasn't thinking about fame. She was thinking about something simpler. Someone had finally treated her like she mattered. The leader of the group quickly stood again, but this time his attitude was completely different. "Look, we didn't know," he said awkwardly. "We were just messing around." Steven shook his head slightly. "That's the problem," he replied. "You shouldn't need to know someone is famous before treating them with decency." The entire restaurant listened quietly. Lena's manager stepped forward nervously, thanking Steven repeatedly. Customers murmured in agreement, praising what they had witnessed. The bullies now looked desperate to escape the attention. One of them placed money hurriedly on the table. "Let's just go," he whispered to his friends. They stood up and quickly headed toward the exit, avoiding eye contact with anyone around them. The same group that once laughed loudly now walked out in complete silence. The tension that had filled the restaurant slowly dissolved. Lena approached Steven carefully, still emotional. "Thank you," she said softly. "You didn't have to do that." Steven gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Sometimes," he said, "people just need someone to remind others how to behave." She nodded, tears forming again, but this time from relief rather than humiliation. Steven quietly returned to his table as the restaurant slowly resumed its normal rhythm, though conversations now buzzed with excitement about what had just happened. Before we continue, think about this moment. Do you think people show respect only after discovering someone is famous or powerful? Or should respect be automatic for everyone? Tell us your honest opinion in the comments. Because what happened next would take this moment far beyond the walls of that restaurant. Within hours, videos recorded by customers would begin spreading across social media. And neither Lena nor the bullies had any idea how big this story was about to become. By the next morning, the quiet incident that had taken place inside the restaurant was no longer quiet. Videos recorded by customers the previous evening had already begun spreading across social media. Different angles of the confrontation appeared online, showing the same powerful moment, a famous actor calmly standing up for a waitress being bullied. Within hours, millions of people had watched the clips. Comments flooded in from around the world. Respect to Steven Seagal. This is how celebrities should use their influence. That waitress deserves all the support. Bullying service workers is disgusting. News pages picked up the story, reposting the footage and praising the calm way the situation had been handled. Many viewers pointed out that Steven never used violence or threats, only words and presence. Back at the restaurant, Lena arrived for her shift feeling nervous. She worried the incident might bring trouble or unwanted attention. But as she stepped inside, something unexpected happened. Her co-workers began clapping. Customers sitting at tables smiled and waved at her. Someone even stood to shake her hand. Confused, Lena looked toward her manager, who grinned widely. "You're famous now," he said, holding up his phone. Lena watched clips of herself on screen, seeing the moment she had tried so hard to survive quietly now being praised worldwide. Messages poured in from strangers offering encouragement and support. One comment read, "To the waitress, your strength is inspiring. Don't let anyone make you feel small." For someone who had spent years trying to avoid attention, the sudden kindness felt overwhelming. Meanwhile, the group of bullies experienced the opposite reaction. Their behavior had been clearly captured on video, and viewers quickly condemned them online. Though their names were not publicly shared, people who recognized them began calling them out for their actions. Sometimes, actions taken in a few careless minutes can follow someone much longer than expected. As for Steven Seagal, he didn't post anything about the incident. He didn't give interviews or seek attention. For him, it had simply been the right thing to do in the moment. But the message he left behind continued spreading. News outlets summarized the story as a reminder of something simple. Respect should not depend on status, fame, or physical ability. Later that evening, Lena found herself serving customers again, but something had changed. People were kinder. Some customers tipped more generously. Others simply thanked her for her hard work. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen, not for her disability, but for her determination. In many ways, the incident became bigger than Steven Seagal or the Bullies. It became a story about everyday dignity. Small acts of courage can create ripples far beyond the moment in which they happen. And before we end this story, we want to ask you something. Have you ever witnessed a moment where one person stood up and changed a situation completely? Share your experience in the comments below. Because stories like this remind us that even in difficult situations, someone choosing kindness or courage can change everything. The restaurant eventually returned to normal, but those who had witnessed the confrontation firsthand would always remember the night the room went silent, not because of fear, but because respect finally entered the conversation. And Lena would never forget the evening when a stranger chose to stand up for her when no one else did. If you believe no one should ever be judged or mocked because of their struggles or appearance, type respect in the comments, and subscribe for more inspiring stories that remind us how powerful simple human decency can be.